All right, there you go. Take it away, Jason.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I met Varun on the Angular 2 subreddit, and he posted some really amazing storybook content. I reached out. I didn't realize quite how impressive of a person I'd been able to snag. But Varun is a developer experience engineer at Chromatic, and he is a contributor to Storybook. He specializes in component-driven development, design systems, and generative art. And he does share a lot of generative art on his Twitter. If you want to follow him on Twitter, I would put his link in the, or his Twitter handle in the chat, but we need to get that figured out. But how are you doing, Varun?
Not so bad, not so bad. Thank you for having me here.
Awesome. I'm pronouncing your name okay, right? That's
yeah,
one of the things that always scares me. So I do a little bit of Googling beforehand. So, you know, you're in Canada and a contributor to Storybook, and we have a little bit of a fireside chat that we'd like to just ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay.
For sure.
All right. So the first question, on Twitter and LinkedIn, you refer to yourself as a finder of new ways to confuse myself. What is the most confusing thing that you have ever done?
So back in design school, for one of my projects, I decided to turn an animated GIF into a sculpture. It was just like a minimal 3D sort of animation. It's like 3 rectangles that were flapping like a bird. That kept me confused for quite a while. Had to learn a lot about woodworking and CAM mechanisms to get that going. So yeah, that was a fun one for sure.
That sounds amazing. Converting a GIF into, wow, like real art. Do you still have that?
No, unfortunately not. But I built it a couple of times though.
That's amazing. That sounds awesome. So question 2, and this one's probably the most important one we have. Obi-Wan, Stranger Things, Umbrella Academy, and why?
Definitely Obi-Wan. You know, Star Wars is always fun, and really enjoying the new TV series. Loved Mandalorian, all that. The other and the other one, Boba Fett one, I guess. The other 2, I just haven't gotten. I've heard great things, but haven't gotten around to watching them yet.
Good answer. Good answer. We have a few Star Wars fans around here. I'm not sure who they are. Brooke. Finally, question 3, and we're seeing this one a bit in the chat tonight. The job market can be demanding right now. Do you have any advice for developers who are currently looking for jobs?
Yeah, I would say just try and be yourself. Like I feel like people feel like they have to put up a bit of an act to sort of please the companies that they're applying at, but I think the interview process works both ways. It's also a chance for you to figure out whether it's a good fit for you or not. So definitely ask a lot of questions, and the company's interviewing you, but also you're interviewing the company. So go in as equals, I would say.
Awesome. Thank you for the advice, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to get to know you a bit better. I'm going to turn the time over to you.
Awesome. I am going to share my screen. So can you all see my slides?
Yeah.
All right, awesome.
Great.
Thank you for having me here. So I'm going to start by stating the obvious. When we build applications these days, when it comes to UIs, we assemble UIs bottom up by building out a bunch of components and then slowly going all the way up to pages, and everything is just a component. But the interesting thing is every component within your application actually has many different variations, variations that might come from different UI state, or in some cases from, supporting multiple teams or internationalization or even responsive behavior. What Storybook enables you to do is essentially it takes your component, detaches it from the application, so you can actually replicate all of these different variations and then store them in a format called the story file format. Within the story file format, you can sort of provide mock inputs to a component or mock API requests, or really mock anything that a component relies on to generate all of these different states. And then during development, you can sort of cycle through each of these states to check whether your component looks the way you expect it to or not. That's kind of the crux of Storybook. It just sort of tries to simplify UI development by cutting out the grunt work of going through all of those UI states and replicating them over and over again. But manual verification only sort of goes so far. Quite often you have to rely on automated tests to ensure that the component is rendering correctly, it's handling events, that the UI is accessible, or data is flowing through your app the way you expect it, and so on. There's a lot to account for. Today, I want to focus on one particular thing, which is interaction testing. And when I say interaction testing, I mean the type of scenario where, let's say, there's a button, the user can click on a button and it opens up a dialog, and then there might be further sort of interactions within the dialog itself. To verify this behavior, often you end up writing an interaction test. So you might be using something like Angular testbed to write out this test, or another sort of really popular combo these days is testing library with Jest. Even with Angular, I feel like this is increasingly a very popular combo. And regardless of sort of what style of tests you're writing, generally the challenge is that these tests are still running in Node in some kind of simulated browser environment, so something like JS DOM. So what happens is you're testing UIs in JS DOM using CLIs. So if a test fails, often you're just left with a whole bunch of text to debug what's happening to the UI. If you're not able to find a particular DOM node, or in a worst case scenario where you have SVG within the component, it just becomes really hard to debug. So with Storybook, we wanted to offer a sort of a better approach to interaction testing, and we've decided to take a more sort of browser-centric approach to interaction testing. Now, when you're writing a test, there are generally sort of three parts to it. You start by setting up some kind of scenario. In component terms, that means you are taking a component, providing some mock input to that component to set up a particular state for that particular component. Then you render that component in isolation, trigger some kind of interactions on top of it, and then lastly, you verify the DOM structure. If you pay close attention to this setup, what you'll notice is those first two things, that's exactly what a story is. So when you write a story, you've already isolated a component, you've given it some inputs, and you've set up a particular scenario, and then Storybook handles the rendering part for you. And now we've actually managed to expand what stories are capable of. So that last bit where you can simulate interactions and run assertions, it's now possible to do that within Storybook itself. In fact, within a story file itself. So when you're writing interaction tests with Storybook, that test lives inside the story file along with all of the other stories that you've already defined to figure out sort of what are the different variations for your component. And the whole thing is powered by testing library and Jest under the hood. So we're not sort of reinventing the wheel here. We're taking tools that developers are already familiar with. We're just bringing it into the context of Storybook. And then lastly, these tests actually run in the browser. So you don't have to debug using the CLI. You get to debug them in the browser using all the sort of browser dev tools that you're familiar with. So let me walk through the process of what this test looks like. You start off by writing a story as you would always. If you've ever used Storybook with Angular, this would look really familiar to you. And now, along with this story, you can attach something called a play function to each story. And this is just a snippet of code that gets executed by Storybook once the story has been rendered. Within this play function, technically, you can write any kind of code to interact with your story, but this is where your test would live. The play function receives the canvas element. That is the container that houses your story. So within, you can use that canvas element to sort of scope queries within that element, find a button, for example, click the button, and then assert what the DOM structure should look like. And all of the sort of the testing utilities that you see here are coming from testing library and are coming from Jest. It's the same sort of syntax that you're already familiar with. The only difference is that we're using a generic version of testing library. So it's something that's not tied to any particular front-end framework. As long as your framework renders something in HTML, you can interact with it. And also, in this case, testing library and Jest have both been instrumented to work within Storybook, and in particular, run within the browser. So when you execute the test, you load up Storybook. Storybook will start by rendering your story. and then it fires the play function to actually execute whatever interaction that you've specified there, and also run any assertions that you might have specified. Now, the cool thing is, because this is running in the browser, and we've instrumented testing library ingest to work within Storybook, you also get an interactive debugging panel. So you can step forward and backwards and go through each step of your test. If something fails, you can pause in a particular step and then just debug the UI using browser dev tools, or sort of replay the whole test just to make sure that things are working the way you expect it to. These tests generally fire only when you're browsing Storybook. So if you open up a story, that's when the test will fire, and that's great when you're developing and working on a component. But usually when you're ready to merge in your work, you'll want to run all of the tests at once. So to help with that, along with Storybook, there's now something called a Storybook test runner. So you run Storybook in one terminal window, and then in a separate terminal window, you can run yarn test Storybook, and that will start the test runner for Storybook. And under the hood, this is powered by Playwright. So it converts all of your stories into tests. So even the ones that don't have play functions, it will check to see that that story is rendering without any particular kind of error. And the ones with play functions, it will check to see that the assertion is passing, the interactions are working the way you expect it to. And the nice thing is, this works both locally or on CI. So if you want to run your tests on CI, you can just run it using the test runner, just like any other sort of Playwright test that you might already be using. And the other benefit of using Playwright under the hood is that you get cross-browser testing kind of for free. You can run your tests in parallel across Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. And then whether you're running it locally or on CI, if you happen to encounter any issue or one of the tests fails, you get a link provided to you via the CLI output. So you can click on that link and it will actually open up the failing story into the browser and will pause on exactly the step that is failing. So again, you don't have to sort of dig through logs to figure out why something is failing. You can straight away jump to a live Storybook instance and see why a particular test is failing. So it makes for a much better debugging experience than debugging UIs through the CLI. And then also, this is a bit of an experimental feature right now, but the test runner does have hooks that you can use to customize and extend its behavior. For example, if you want to capture image snapshots or run accessibility checks, you can use these hooks to execute some of that kind of behavior. For example, here I've set up the test runner to run Axe Playwright or run Axe on every story within your Storybook. And the way that works is I'm using Axe Playwright here, and then in the pre-render hook, I simply inject Axe onto the page, and in the post-render hook, I actually run the check ally function to run the Axe check. So now when you run your test runner, it's both going to run interaction tests and also Axe. So if it finds any accessibility issues, you will get an output that displays what kind of errors or warnings it found. So ultimately, what's happening here is you're kind of treating stories as test cases for everything that a component does. Within Storybook, there are sort of built-in mechanisms for running interaction tests. There's actually an add-on that will run Axe for you within Storybook itself too. And then you can also import stories into other testing tools. So along with the test runner, there is also a Storybook testing Angular library that allows you to import stories into Cypress test or Playwright test or even a Jasmine test. So you don't have to do that setup work over and over again. If you've written a story, you can just import it into those testing frameworks or into something like Chromatic, which is a visual regression testing service. So it will take a snapshot of all of your stories. So really, if you're writing stories, you're getting a lot more than just speeding up your development process. You're also doing sort of 2/3 of what you have to do to write automated tests for your components, and then you can take those stories to all kinds of tools that you might already be using. So I've just focused on sort of the interaction bit today. If you are interested, there is a tutorial on our site called UI Testing Handbook that kind of goes through all the different types of UI testing that's required and how sort of Storybook helps you in all of those scenarios. So if you're interested, please check it out at storybookjs.org/tutorials. And that's everything I had to share today. Thank you.
Wow. Chau told us that you can have his slot and just keep talking. That was amazing. There was some incredible stuff in that short presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Dimitri asks, is there support for Angular?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, we're using testing library DOM under the hood. So as long as you are writing components that render to HTML, you'll be able to work with the Storybook and writing fraction tests.
Wow, that's amazing. Just from me, I'm gonna be a little bit selfish here because this was incredible. So say you have like a third party auth service. Is that a solved problem within Storybook testing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the cool thing about Storybook is there is a pretty wide add-on ecosystem. So for something like I have a component that relies on some kind of API request.
Mm-hmm.
You can use the mock service worker add-on, which will intercept the request that you're making and allow you to respond with mock data at the story level, at the component level, or even at the global level. So you can use that.
Wow.
But if you're using something specific like GraphQL or Apollo, there are similar sort of mocking library add-ons for Storybook for all of those services. So it's quite similar to what you would do with any other testing, where there's built-in mechanisms for mocking API requests. You can mock providers to pass in data that's coming from sort of this is more for React specific thing, but often in React you access data through context. So that's another kind of thing you can mock within Storybook. Wow,
that's amazing. Ty asks, does it test standalone components in Angular yet?
That's a really good question. I'm gonna say no because I haven't seen a lot of standalone components with Storybook yet, but it's something for me to look into.
Okay.
Yes. I played around with standalone components in Storybook and also testing library, and the standalone components make everything simpler.
Wow.
Okay, cool. Great to know. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Varun. I think I'm going to ask Brooke to demote me from panelist so that I can interact with the chat. But thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun tonight, you guys.
I've been over here cursing Zoom because we found some documentation on how to fix the problem with chat. And so I went and looked at it, and sure enough, it doesn't follow the documentation. So I tried, everyone, I'm sorry. But yeah, Jason, thank you for helping. So I will demote him. But actually, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris is going to introduce one of my favorite people from New Zealand. He's like just such an amazing.
Well, that narrows it down. You could have stopped at favorite people.
Well, he is. He's just awesome. So, Chris, will you please introduce Craig and
Sure.
ask him more fun questions?
Yeah, definitely. All right, Craig. So Craig is a full stack architect and developer from Auckland, New Zealand. He works remotely for a UK company building a SaaS solution for workforce management and healthcare. He's been writing code since the early 80s, but his web journey started in the late 90s and ramped up with AngularJS and then Angular. His real passion is for building great user experiences. And outside of work, he enjoys walking, cycling, and is a keen musician by playing the piano and singing in a choir. Yeah, so we do have some fun questions for you. I know before we started, we were kind of talking about your recent trip to the Shearer area, which is behind you there. But have you been to any of the other filming locations like Mordor or the Lonely Mountain?
I've not been to Mordor, which is known in New Zealand as Tongariro National Park, but that's certainly on my bucket list. There's a great walk that you can do called the Tongariro Track, which I would like to do one day. So yeah, I have been down to the South Island to Milford Sound, where some of the filming was done, which is quite iconic, with sort of a pair of mountains that sort of rise up out of the mist, and it's quite amazing. but yes, this past weekend we took a trip down to Hobbiton and experienced that, which was quite cool.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful country. I mean, you can definitely see why they chose it as a filming location for Lord of the Rings.
Indeed.
Yeah, so going back to you're a musician and you're a singer. So if you could only sing or play the piano for the rest of your life and not the other, which would you choose?
I think I would have to choose piano. It's something that I really enjoy doing. I kind of like to sit down at the piano and sort of pick out maybe an 80s pop tune and sort of reinterpret it, and that's kind of one of the enjoyable things that I might do on, say, a Friday night. So my most recent tune that I picked up was Kate Bush's Running Up a Hill, and I have the original Kate Bush CD from the 80s.
Well, you have to now with Stranger Things, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I finished watching Stranger Things, and it was absolutely awesome. Quite a marathon effort to get through the whole thing, but it was very enjoyable.
Yeah, it's amazing having a single episode that goes a full length of like a film, 2 hours and what was it, 20 minutes or something.
Indeed.
And right now it's winter in New Zealand. Do you have any favorite wintertime activities or hobbies?
So I would love to be able to say that I'm a fantastic skier and snowboarder, but alas, my brother's got those genes in the family. So no, I just tend to sort of enjoy listening to the rain at night, and we've had certainly a ton of that recently. But I also do like to do a bit of photography. So winter's often quite a good time to, particularly to stay down in the South Island, getting some very nice lake shots down there.
Awesome. All right, well, I'll turn it over to you and let you talk about Formally. I'm really excited to learn more about this.
Sure. Right. Now, hopefully this technology is going to work. I will share my screen. Right. Can you see that? Is that all working okay?
Yes, yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, good. All right. Okay. So so let's get going. So I'm going to talk today about Formally and how you can be super productive with building Angular forms. So I'm just going to sort of briefly talk about the different form choices that we have in Angular. We'll do a quick overview of reactive and template-driven forms, and then we'll have a look at Formally, delving into that. I'll show how I can build a custom API for Formally. And then finally, if we get to it, we'll look at some advanced techniques. So just about me, I think Chris sort of covered it. So I've been writing code since sort of the late 80s professionally, and sort of been doing Angular for probably since about 2014. So yes, that's my bread and butter basically. What are the form choices we've got in Angular? So there's the reactive forms, template-driven forms, Formally, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly today, and you could actually roll your own, but that's generally not recommended. So just delving into reactive forms. So this is what the Angular docs recommend, so what you do there is you have your form component, and you define your form controls and form groups as objects inside your component class, or you use the film builder service. And then in your template, you add all your controls and you connect them up to the form controls that you built in your components class itself. So I'm sure this is probably fairly familiar to most people who've had a look at any forms in Angular. You're going to pick a library such as Angular Material or Bootstrap, and you're going to be sort of sticking to that library as you build out your application. So just a quick look at some code there. So in your component, you would be defining all your form controls, and this is using the form builder here. And this is probably a fairly simple form. Typically, you would be adding a lot more validators and that sort of thing. And then in your template, so I've chosen Angular material here. So you've got a mat form field for each of the inputs, and that's wrapping an input element, and you are using the form control name to connect up to the form control that was built in the component class. So that's reactive. So there's template-driven forms as well. So you do all the work in your template, essentially. We're using the banana in a box, the ng model. So you've got two-way data binding with a model in your component. The component contains the model structure, and again, you're going to be picking a library. So, for example, Angular material. This is recommended by Ward Bell. There's a great presentation that he did on YouTube at, I think, ng-conf, which talks about template-driven forms compared to reactive forms, and he's strongly on the template-driven forms side of things. I would challenge him to have a look at Formly. Template-driven code, it's relatively simple. So in the template itself, you've got the structure of the form, and this looks very similar to the reactive forms, except that now we've got the ng model, and you're connecting to your model in your component itself. So I'm sure most people have had a look at that. So how does Formly differ? Okay, so Formly is an open source project. It's been around since about 2016 for Angular, and it was previously in Angular JS as well. So you define your fields that you want on your form as a plain JavaScript object inside your component class. And then the template itself is almost empty. You just have, you define a Formly form, and you connect it up to a model and fields, and that's the extent of your template. So Formly's job is to take your field definitions and render those fields out into user interface controls in your chosen framework. So just having a quick look at how that works. So here in your component class, you would define your fields as being an array of Formly field config objects, and each of those defines a key which connects up to a property on your model, and a type that specifies what type of user interface control to render. So those ones there are all showing input controls. You've got template options that lets you parameterize the particular control. So you've got label for your control, whether it's required, perhaps a maximum length. So that's the basics of specifying your form fields in Formly. Okay, so what I've got is I've got an application that I built, which I'd like to demo. So I'm hoping that I can just switch desktops here. Is that visible?
No, we still see your slideshow.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Let me just switch this across to a different screen. Okay, you should be able to see that now.
Nope.
Oh, damn. Okay, let me just.
We've all been having a lot of fun with Zoom today.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Let's try that. Yes.
Yes, there it is.
Right. Okay. So this is a demo application. So what I've got is I built the same form in 4 different ways. So this is using the reactive approach. This is the template-driven approach. This is using Formly, and then I'll show you the productive one a bit later. But the idea here is that it's just a relatively simple form with a whole bunch of fields on it, and then an address panel which groups those together. Yeah, right. So let me just jump back to the presentation. That's back at the presentation. Yes. Okay, so why do we want to use Formly? Okay, so with Formly, we can build very complex forms with minimal effort. It's very much large enterprise app focused. And so it's library agnostic. So with Formly, you can choose a companion library, so you can choose Angular Material or Bootstrap or Ionic or PrimeNG, and then the same field definitions would work with any of those libraries. So Formally is then responsible for rendering out your form controls as user interface controls in whatever your chosen library is. So it's essentially abstracting away the implementation of the controls. It supports all your standard components like inputs and checkboxes and radio buttons and selects and so on, or you can augment that by building your own custom templates. So by enterprise forms, I mean applications with a huge number of forms. So the applications I work on have got in excess of 200 forms in them. So that's quite a lot of forms to build. We typically see there are a lot of complex layout, and on that, often on the web, I see recommendations that forms should just be laid out as a sort of a vertical list of controls. My opinion on that is in the enterprise applications where you've got a lot of complexity, users generally want to see a lot more data on the screen at one time, and just having a vertical list of controls generally is not going to fly very well. And there's often a strong need for consistency when you develop the application, that you want all your forms to look the same and behave the same. And then we need to consider in the refactoring costs too. So if you're going to be using reactive or template-driven forms, if, say, Angular Material comes out with some new features that you want to implement across all of your forms, then you've got a huge amount of work to do in order to introduce those new features. Whereas with Formally, you could pick up a new version and those features would then automatically be rendered. So I've talked about how we configure the fields. We can then look at some advanced configuration. So as well as just specifying the parameters for the field controls, you can have things called expression properties to dynamically update the template options. So, for example, you can say that this particular field here is disabled if this other field is false. Or you can implement this as a function. And of course, because it's a function, you can then do a whole bunch of complex code in there if you want to do that. It also allows you to connect to an observable. So this plays nicely with component store or anything that's going to return you an observable. So this particular silly piece of code here would simply delay disabling a control for 1 second. And so you can connect up these expression properties to any of the template options. So you could have a component store or any other service which then allowed you to control the rendering of that control. So say whether or not it's required, or what the label on it is, or whether it should be hidden based upon an observable or some other combination of properties on the model. So this is really powerful stuff. And as I said, it plays nicely with NGRX component store. You can configure validation messages centrally in one place. So, for example, when you configure Formally, you would set up your validation messages. So you would say, whenever there's a required validation, I want to show the message, this field is required. Or you can get more complex. You can implement a function. So what we're doing here is we're having a look to see whether there's a required message property on the template options. If so, we're just going to return that. Otherwise, we'll look to see whether there's a label, and we'll build up a message that says this, whatever the field label is required. And you can do that for any type of validation messages. So I've got some minimum and maximum validations here, where it's going to return the name of the field and what the minimum or the maximum must be. So without having to do a lot of work in the template or in the field control definitions themselves, you've got access essentially automatically to all these validations. Another thing I'd like to demonstrate too is you can have wrappers. So you can say wrap a set of fields in a panel, and that involves defining a component that lets you do that. So here we are in Angular material land, and so I've got a mat card, and so we're just creating a custom component called a panel wrapper component, which extends the field wrapper class, which is provided by Formally. And so we are taking the label out of the template options, and then we're just inserting the fields that it is wrapping inside the mat card content. So that works very nicely. And then you just configure this in the Formally configuration. So you'd say whenever we see the panel wrapper, we want to render everything inside this panel wrapper component. And then inside our field definitions, we just say, here's the wrappers panel, and you can have multiple wrappers if you wanted to. The template options for that is the label has address on it, and then the field group then are all the components, all the fields that will appear inside that wrapped component. So let's look at some code. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm just going to switch over to I need to switch screens again. I was hoping to show you some code from Visual VS Code. Are you able to see VS Code?
No, it looks like we're still seeing your slides.
Okay.
No worries, though, Craig. Take your time.
There
It
we
always
go.
happens right in presentations.
Yes.
So,
Is that you can see VS Code now?
yeah.
Yep.
Right.
Looks good.
Okay. Very good. Very good. I tried to be too clever, I think. Okay. So, yes, what I was going to show you. Okay. Right. I think you can see my presentation again. Yes. Right. So just looking at inside VS Code, and this is something I haven't encountered before. Right. Okay. Sorry, this has derailed me a little bit. Okay. So this is here. Here is the.
Hey, real quick,
here-
Craig.
Sorry.
Sorry, we just had somebody in chat ask if you could increase the font size of your editor.
Okay. How's that?
Great,
better?
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So this is essentially that form being rendered. So this is the example I showed before, and then as you scroll down here, here is the panel with the field group appearing inside there. So just to look at some more code here. So I've got a select field with a gender ID. This is using an observable to get the available genders. Another one here for the titles. And then down here, I've got a toggle for the accept email. And then down here is email address. And here's some of these expression properties where you can say this field is going to be disabled if the accept email is not true. Okay, so back to the presentation. So you can also have custom templates. So these are some examples from my own application. So what I've got here is I've got a custom template which allows the users to select a combination of ranks or grades. This is a medical application. Over here, there's a custom template which lets users choose security settings for particular security groups. And then down here, there's a way of choosing all staff or certain staff for a particular report. And of course, you can compose together existing fields as well as building new ones. So defining a custom template is pretty easy. All you do is you build a new component, and that extends the formally field type. You can access whatever options you've got in your template options via this.to, and then you just register it with formally. So for example, here I've got a color picker. So whenever the type in my fields is a color picker, then it will render this formally color picker field component. And then so using the new type here is a matter of just saying type is color picker, and then providing whatever template options your component needs. And I've got a parameter here called convert BGR, which is for a legacy system that I work on that happen to represent RGB color values as BG, as blue, green, red, which is a little weird when you try and display those on the web and they appear the completely wrong color. But, okay, so this is all still quite verbose. So for any complex form, defining all the fields is going to be necessarily complex. And at this moment, it's not type safe, so you can go and type the field names incorrectly, and it'll be none the wiser. So the user will start typing into a field, and it'll update the wrong property on the model. And also, there's no real way of laying out the form in a way that's sort of pleasing for the user. So what I want to do is to show how I like to be very productive with Formally. So the way I do this is by building my own custom internal API to define my forms. And I use TypeScript generics and the key of type operator so that the access to the properties on my model object is type safe. You can't get the name wrong. And what I do is I build custom methods per field type and for layouts as well. And as a bonus, we get automatic responsive forms. So let's look at some code. So I'm hoping I can switch back to, you can see Visual Studio Code?
Yes, looks good.
Yep, cool. All right. So if I just switch over here. So what I've got now is, this is using my productive way of building things. So I've got I've introduced a service which I've called the custom form builder service. And so what that now does is it lets you call this method called build fields, and you provide your interface, which describes the structure of your model. So if we just open that up, then here are the fields that are on the model. And so here there's a callback function which takes a typed builder, which is parameterized for the type that we passed in up here, and then I just call methods on this to build out the fields. So you can sort of see the structure of the form here. So I'm using a CSS flexbox row to define some fields here. Then I've got another row, and I'm putting some fields in there. And then down here, I've got a row, and I'm putting in my panel wrapper, and I've got my fields in here. So this is sort of a very productive way of building the form. So if we say looked at this particular method here, text field, then this is inside my typed builder. And so this is just delegating out to a function which builds a text field, and it has an interface on it for some options that specify exactly what options are available on a text field. So if we just delve into here, I'll just make that a bit bigger. So all this is a function that takes the type of the object, which defaults to object if you don't provide one, takes the key off the interface, and then some options. So the options here let us provide a maximum length for a text field, and that extends input options that has a whole bunch of other stuff on it, which also extends standard options, which has a whole bunch of other stuff on it. So I'm sort of providing this sort of multi-level hierarchy of classes for building out forms. So what this is doing here is it's basically taking that key that we're passing in, taking the type as an input, and then applying these input options from the options we've provided here. And then it's saying, okay, apply this CSS class so that I can do some specific styling on particular types of fields. And then it's going and adding in the maximum length. So I've implemented these fields here, these functions that build out different types of fields for that suit what my application needs. Now, in my real application, I've got about 30 different types of fields that I've built up. So just coming back here, so that basically lets us sort of build out our form in a sort of quite an intuitive manner. You can sort of see the structure of the form very easily. So if we actually switch over to this here, so if I go into my productive one here, so this is what that code is generating. So it has laid out this form into rows, and there's the panel, here's my row here. And just to demonstrate the reactive nature of this, if I go into, the responsive nature of this, if I go into the developer tools, then I can adjust the size of my form and things respond nicely and change their size. And the way that I've done that is that I've basically added sizing parameters onto each of these fields, and I've got some media queries that automatically adjust flexbox sizes when there are particular breakpoints hit. So when the screen becomes smaller, some of these fields then jump down to be to basically wrap around. So that actually works quite nicely. Just coming back to the presentation. So I've basically covered how that custom form builder service works. One thing I'd like to show you is why I did this. So in our existing application, we've got the ability for administrators to set up their own user-defined security. And I'm just going to play this little video here. And so what happens is that an administrator can come into a particular screen, and then they can go in through all of the fields in the screen and configure as to whether those fields are visible or read-only or available for that particular security group. So when a user logs in, they have a security group they belong to. So the screen is basically customized for that particular user, so they only get to see the fields that they have access to, and they can only interact with the fields that aren't read-only. And so the reason for doing that then is that when I build the fields in my code, just coming back here, if we look at how this is implemented, build fields calls the runs the callback to build the fields by passing in this typed builder. And then once the field structure is built, I go and recurse the fields, and it goes and looks up the security that needs to be applied to each of those fields. And if it finds that the control should be hidden, then it basically just snips that control out. If it's read-only, then it sets a property to force it to be disabled. So this is a really nice way of basically dynamically controlling the security aspects of the form. So just carrying on. So one more thing I wanted to cover here is sometimes you want to be able to break out of a formally form. So you might be able to implement all of your components as custom components, but sometimes you just want to be able to put some Angular template code inside your form. So what I do here is I define a special field type that defines an insert point. And I've got this field type called a transportable field outlet. And that simply provides a class. And then I can go and put this component, which I call a UI transportable. It takes this breakout host query selector, and it uses the CDK portal to go and transport that chunk of content into the middle of my form. So just to see that in operation, if we come back here, I've got this thing here that toggles the advanced mode. And so what that does is it then goes and lets this piece of content here be seen. So this is just coming from an Angular template inside the form. And I've got some interaction here with the component store. So this is disabling this field once it's been clicked more than 10 times, and I can reset that count. So just to come back to the code to look at that. Yeah, so here's my form, and then here's this piece of template content that's going to be inserted into the middle of the form at runtime, which makes it a nice, easy way of sort of combining the best of both worlds of your automatically generated forms, but also being able to go and put some custom content into the middle of your form where you need it. So to summarize, I've sort of just scratched the surface of what form you can do. There's a ton more stuff. I've not yet encountered a scenario that I can't implement with Formally that I would have to sort of fall back to reactive or template-driven forms. I hope I've demonstrated how productive Formally can be. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that I haven't covered. So just to summarize, the Formally project on the web has some very good documentation with a ton of stack blitz examples that you can dig into. I generally find that you have to spend a bit of time in stack blitz to figure it all out. I've shared my demo project, which is on GitHub, so you can drill into that and have a look around with it, edit it if you like. And Yuri has put together a free egghead.io course, which goes into a lot of detail of how to use Formally. And I invite you to come and follow me on Twitter. So happy to take some questions.
Yeah, it's a really awesome tool. I'm really looking forward to trying it out myself. We do have a few questions from the chat.
Sure.
Ty asked, does this support the new Angular type forms that's available in Angular 14?
At this stage, I've not sort of really been able to make that work. I know that there is a new version of it formally on the way. So currently it's on version 5. There's a version 6 that's in the works. What I find is that because you are defining your fields and you're connecting them up to your model, and you've got that sort of strongly typed connection between the fields and the model, that you're dealing with the model, which already has all the type information on it. So I've not generally found so far to have found the new typed fields to be of use in this particular scenario.
We also had a question from Reynold, who asked, if you wanted to create a UI that lets users build the form dynamically using Formally, how would you approach that with the Formally library?
So there's various ways you can do that. Because the definition of your field is essentially just a JSON object, you could have some sort of user interface which allowed users to build up selections of forms and then essentially store that maybe in a database and pull that back and have that then rendered by Formally on the screen. So that would work really, really well. And I have done that sort of thing in the past. Okay,
very cool. We also just had one come in from Thomas that said, how much does Formally affect the bundle size?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's pretty small. I don't see it being a huge bundle size effect, but then I'm in the sort of area of writing about enterprise applications, which often don't care too much about bundle size. The application I'm working on at the moment, though, I'm being very, very careful with the bundle size, and I have a sort of a startup bundle size of a few hundred K. Which I'm quite pleased with.
Yeah, definitely. And then our last question we had from Chris He asked if he hasn't learned Angular forms yet, so maybe for like a new developer or someone that's new to Angular, would you recommend starting with Formally, or would you recommend learning what the framework provides first?
I think it's always valuable to have a good understanding of what happens underneath the surface before you try and use a library that makes you more productive. I think you might well get into some sticky situations if you don't have a good understanding of what's going on underneath the surface. And because Formally is built on top of reactive forms, you can always sort of one thing I didn't cover is the ability to have hooks where you can basically jump in, so you can get a callback when the Formally builds the form control for your particular field, and then you're back into reactive forms land with form controls, and you can go and do whatever you want with the form control at that time. So on that basis, it would be very useful to have a good understanding of what's happening underneath the surface.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for presenting. It's such a cool library. I think a lot of people are going to be going home after this and making their own little projects, trying it out. So
yeah,
thank you so much again.
Yeah, quite happy to be hit up on Twitter and ask questions about it.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Brooke, who's going to introduce our next speaker, who is Chau. Brooke?
And Craig, be sure to look at the chat, because there were people leaving comments and, saying all sorts of great things. So check out the chat.
Thanks.
But, yeah, let's move on to our last speaker. And Chau, before I get any further, I think a lot of us are wondering, like, what are you laughing at? Who's making you laugh over there?
Nothing. It's just the chat, to be honest with you. Okay. So the first time I was cracking up was during Varun presentation, and I sent the chat say Varun can take my slot and keep talking.
Oh, nice.
And then this time when Greg was presenting, I sent in the chat, I hate going last.
Right. Well, you're going last. I can rearrange that next time, though. I will make a note of that. But this is one thing I love about Chau, is that he's always happy and smiling and laughing. So we're really, just excited to have you here with us. Let me kind of introduce you, though. I would say most people are probably familiar with who Chau is, but just because we like to share how much he does, and I think this is always fun to just see just how busy he is. But Chau, aside from being an Angular GDE, he's currently a senior engineer at Nrwl, and he's worked previously at companies like Architect Now and Swimlane, which is a security automation and orchestration company. And aside from being a GDE and working at Nrwl, he also works to bring the best engineering practices to web application production. But he's doing that with a whole bunch of side projects. So some of the things that he's working on, he's the creator of AutoMapper for TypeScript. And then he's also a creator for ng-neat Tailwind for Angular. And then he's one of the core members of Nest.js. And he's also one of the founders of the Angular Vietnam Meetup. So you can go hang out with him there if you ever have time to go to the Vietnam meetups. And then really, you can just find him all over. I'm constantly seeing Chau everywhere. He blogs, he has an active blog. He's always on Twitter, constantly leaving comments and chatting with people there. And then he does live streams, and he loves to contribute to open source as well. So yeah, just a lot, Chau. And I'm going to ask you about that here in a second. But when he's not doing all of that, when he's not busy running around Twitter and blogging and streaming, he's a very dedicated husband and father, and family is really important to him, which is actually what he's doing right now. So if you didn't catch the first few minutes before we went, before we started the meetup, Chau was telling us that he's in Vietnam and he's there visiting some family. But Chau, what would you say, if somebody's never been to Vietnam before, what is something that a first-time visitor should really not miss?
Definitely, and any of the food that you have outside of Vietnam that has Vietnamese name like pho or banh mi, should definitely try it here. Yeah. visit some big cities, Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, Da Nang. And if you're here now or in the next 2 months, I will take you to this island called Phu Quoc Island, which is my favorite place of all time. So.
Okay, just like a little remote island, kind of private, or what makes it so great?
The scenery is great,
Nice.
and it is a developing island though. It's not very remote, but
Okay.
it's still there's some remote area. But I love the beach there. The weather is great. The food is also great, and I will take you personally.
That is something you can't beat, everybody. But okay, now I'm curious too. Have you found any pho that you would say is comparable to what you'd find in Vietnam? Like as you've been here in the States, is there anything that compares, or are we
None.
way off? No.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep trying. All right. What is when you're not coding or programming? What's your favorite activity to be doing in your free time?
Lego and cycling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this like stationary spin cycling, or you actually take your bike out?
I take my bike
out in the city? Okay. Yeah. And then do you have a favorite Lego set that you've built?
The typewriter.
Oh, really? Okay, I've seen that one. That's pretty cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. And then, okay, so this kind of goes back. I'm slightly hinted I was going to ask you about this, but I was telling you, like, I'm just always seeing you everywhere on Twitter, on social media. You do your live streams. You obviously have a full-time job. You're a very busy contributor, active contributor to the Angular community. But one thing that impresses me the very most is how you just have a really good understanding of a lot of different topics. You have this passion that just extends over, everything you touch, everything you do. And I'd love to hear, how would you suggest that other people can, level up their skills as well? Like, do you have things that you feel like you do that really help you to retain what you're learning and, add those new skills to your tool belt? Just what kind of advice can you give people for learning?
In my own experience, I learn a lot and I retain a lot by sharing. Once I share my knowledge, I learn that knowledge twice. Like just the other day, when people were talking about like common module being broken up into like standalone directives and pipes, and people were like wondering about the bundle size. I'm like, why don't I just answer that myself? It's just so I create like a new project. I run through some analyzer and like figure out the bundle size is not that big the difference. And then the common module is being like pre-shared away already. So that's something that I learned, and then I share it, and now I remember it forever. So, and then I guess like people say, if you love what you do, you don't ever work. So that's what I feel like. I enjoy doing this kind of thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I know it's not easy to find time, but I agree with that. When you're passionate about it, it's not work. It's fun. So cool. Well, I don't want to take any more time away from your presentation. We're all really eager to hear more about what you have to share, and it's Declarative Three.js in Angular. So I will let you take it away.
Thank you. All right, I want to share my screen. So, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Let me bump up the font size a little bit. So today I'm going to be talking about a side project, another side project that I'm working on, and I call it Angular 3, and we're going to get into the Angular 3. And here's a joke for you. So you can I let you digest that joke yourself. And I'm not going to be able to look at the chat. So all the questions, if asked during the presentation, I will answer them. If not, I will answer them at the end of the presentation. And the reason why I said I don't like going last because I'm not prepared enough because of the time difference. So everything's going to be happening inside of my IDE in WebStorm. And before the presentation, I already prepared a new Angular CLI project with the latest one, Angular 14.1. All right, so let's go with this. So today we're going to be talking about Declarative, Three.js, and Angular. Here's my Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. I tweet about Angular, NX, and all sort of stuff around TypeScript and web development. And this is my GitHub. You want to keep up to date with all my work. All my work is open source, so GitHub is a good place to also. You can just jump into any of my project and like share discussion on the issue. You probably can talk to me there. All right, so in this talk, I want to go briefly over what like 3D on the web, Three.js is, and how does this look like inside of Angular, and what can we do to, how can we do better to integrate like 3D instead of Angular project. All right, so 3D on the web. So it's basically the WebGL API, and that has been around for a long, long time. But it is hard, and it is very primitive, low level. When you work with like WebGL API or 3D on the web, you're basically working with like triangles, vectors, and you have to figure out like the coordinations of all of those inside the 3D space. You can learn more about the WebGL API on MDN, a very good introductory to WebGL, and has so many different links, references to more comprehensive guides on WebGL. And then that will take us to Three.js. So Three.js is a like an abstraction. So people say like Three.js is a 3D library. It's not. Three.js is an abstraction over the WebGL. So instead of WebGL, let's say you want to make a cube, a box, right? In WebGL, you're going to have to find the coordination of the 8 points of that box, and then you have to draw the triangles connecting those points, of vectors connecting those points. So in Three.js, that gives you a little bit of higher abstraction. So if you want to make a box, they have a box geometry that will draw all of those for you already. And if you go to the Three.js website, the homepage is a collection of all the examples built with Three.js. And one of the most familiar one to, like, I guess, people here would probably be this GitHub club. So this club right here is the homepage of GitHub when you're not logged in. If you're logged in, you have to go to /home. Sometimes you might not be able to see it. So this club is I guess, a sphere, right? A simple sphere with some coordination of the continents. But like these graph right here, these vectors are actually real-time data of PRs, commits being made around the world. Very, very cool application, right? So that's Three.js. And I want to mention about the React 3 fiber. I have some problem here. The React 3 fiber, or R3F. So every time someone in the React ecosystem wants to do something with 3D, they will reach for React 3 fiber. I've known people that like when they put Angular and React on a scale for the next project, and then that next project happens to be, I mean, muted. No, that next project happens to be involved with 3D. They pick React instead of Angular because of React 3 fiber. Right. So I kind of want to have something like that for the Angular ecosystem. In the Angular ecosystem, we do have some solutions out there for Three.js with Angular, but it's not well known. But they're not well known. For some reason, they're not being promoted. The authors is not very active. So I kind of want to take that torch and make something for the Angular ecosystem. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere, but here's my solution. All right, so because we don't have enough time, I'm just going to go over the vanilla Three.js code inside of Angular. Before we do that, I just want to quickly go to the Three.js documentation site. And on the first time you land on the documentation site, Three.js is going to teach you how to create a scene. So everything inside your 3D project or a Three.js application starts with a scene, and when they mention the scene, they talk about the 3D scene graph. So when you build a 3D scene on the web, you kind of build like a graph of hierarchy of objects. So you have objects inside of objects, inside of objects, inside of objects. And at the root of that graph will be a scene, a 3D scene. So I just scroll to the bottom of this page and I copy this piece of like working code here, right? And I paste that inside of an ng on init, and I wrap everything inside of run outside of Angular. And that's what I have in my app component right here, right? And I have a canvas element with view child, and then I pass this canvas element to the renderer. And I'm gonna touch on the renderer a little bit right here. So now I'm gonna run my application. Actually, I'm running it. And here you have a spinning cube. So that's 3D on the web. Now, this is vanilla Three.js code, so there are a couple of problems with it. The first one is it's not reactive to the resize event. So now if I resize my browser, I have to hit refresh to just go back to the center. And again, if I widen my browser or viewport, it's not reactive. And there was another problem, but I fixed that by wrapping instead of the run outside of Angular, is that if I pull up the Angular DevTools and it took out the run outside of Angular, you will see chain detection being triggered a lot, or more like 60 frames per second, because Three.js or any animation library is calling request animation frame, and that just like the guts of animation. Then you change stuff frame by frame by frame, and then you run that code frame by frame by frame, so it looks animated. So this one actually is being patched by Zone.js, and if you don't wrap it instead of a run outside of Angular, you're gonna have chain detection triggered like 60 frames per second. All right, and that is the vanilla Three.js code. So we have the scene, we have the camera, and we have the renderer. And at the end of everything, we're gonna render the scene with the camera. So you need the camera to like look around the 3D scene. I'm sorry. Come on, sorry, family. So we have the renderer, the scene, the camera. Those three are the main three building blocks of any Three.js application. There's a set size here. So this is one limitation, is that you use the window width. So it's always full screen, but sometimes you want to limit your like 3D scene inside of like the container, a set container, and you want to place that container anywhere on your viewport. Second thing is very imperative. This type of code is very imperative. Like, what if you want to make another cube? You're gonna have to create another cube, and then you have to call scene.add cube into it. So imperative. And like, what do you want to destroy a cube? You want to take out a cube, right? All that sort of interactions that you have to think about, and also the resize event, right? You have to listen to the resize event and then stop listening when you destroy the component or something like that. So how can we make it better? Imagine that we have something like this. So I want to have like a scene component, and then I want inside of that scene I have a mesh, which is the cube. I want to put the mesh inside of the scene, and then I want to put like the geometry and the material inside the mesh to say, hey, the geometry and the material belong to this mesh, right? But remember, our Three.js application has also the camera and the renderer as the building block, so we cannot just have scene. So that's why we have an entity canvas, which is a like special canvas that Angular 3 provides with the scene, the camera, and the renderer. And then the rest is just exactly the same. So this is the kind of model that I want to have for Angular 3, and Angular actually can help with that by providing content protection and dependency injection. All right, so how it works, right? If you are an Angular developer and you work with like content protection before, this kind of template is very familiar. You have some parent component, and you want to project the content or just set up the relationship, and you have some content child. So inside of the parent component, you might have something like this. You have an ng-content, and then you can also query for this child component by using the content child or content children. Now, the one thing that a lot of people miss or not realize is that you don't have to have ng-content. You don't have to have ng-content. Like as soon as you have this kind of template and the Angular compiler runs through it, the Angular compiler will establish the relationship parent and child, regardless of the ng-content being there or not. So you always can do this content child. And the opposite is also true. So as soon as you have this kind of template, Angular compiler will then set up the child to extend from the parent injector. It means that we can inject the parent inside of the child using dependency injection, and not just the parent. Anything that you put in the providers can be injected inside of the child. So imagine you have a parent component with a component store, right, as the public API for your parent. You don't want to inject the parent, but you want to inject the store to interact with something. Here you can inject the parent store because of this relationship. One thing that I want to call out is that there's also view providers. So the difference between these is confusing at first, but if you know what it means, it's very easy. I'm going to show you a trick. So view providers, you have content child, you have view child, right? If you know the difference between these two, you will know the difference between these two. So view providers are only made available to view child, right? So if you want something that is not accessible by the content child, you put that in the view providers. I want to call that out quickly, right? So just this, and Angular 3 based on this model alone, like dependency injection, hierarchy dependency injection. So this is bring up the entity mesh and the box geometry and the basic material. And here's some pseudocode. So let's assume that geometry is a common geometry class. So it can inject the common mesh, a mesh class. And in ng-init, I just create that geometry. And then I attach the geometry on the mesh, right? Same thing with the material here, with material and then attaching on the mesh. So now this kind of hierarchy on the template is possible thanks to dependency injection, right? And then this is the implementation of the box geometry and the mesh basic material. So in Three.js, there are many geometries and many materials. So you need to have some kind of base, either by like directive composition or by inheritance. And then there's a problem with like the parent isn't always a mesh. So this is another example, is that you have a mesh and then you have the group as the parent of the mesh, or you have the canvas as the parent of the color. So it's not always the mesh. So this code right here is not actually working, right? But then you have injection token to the rescue. Let's assume that my entity mesh will provide an injection token called object ref, right? And I grab the instance, which is the mesh object. But then I have entity group, I have the same provider with NGT object ref using the group instance. So when I use NGT group, my object ref would be the group. When I use NGT mesh, my object ref would be the mesh. Then inside of the NGT instance, this is the base class. I can inject the object ref as my parent, and I say skip self. So skip self is an important resolution modifier. That's what I call it, resolution, because when you inject something, when you dependency inject something, Angular resolves or tries to resolve that dependency for you. So these are called resolution modifier. So now in this case with the NGT group and NGT mesh, my mesh already provide its own object ref. So if I don't have skip self, I will run into circular dependency. Because it's trying to inject the object ref that it provides. So I have to say skip self. Then Angular will skip this injector and will go to the group. So I always get the immediate parent by using object ref. Same thing here. I have an NGT mesh without any parent. So it's going to walk up to the canvas. And on the canvas, I provide the scene, like the building block, the main building block, the scene as the object ref. So this mesh right here, its parent will be the scene. So the skip self is the key to work with like recursive recursive injection token. All right, I think that's the guts of Angular 3. I don't have enough time to go into too deep, but if you are if you want to reach out to me, I can spend like an hour, 2 hours walking you over the code base. Hopefully you can become a contributor, because right now it's just me. Okay, so now we kind of know how it works. I'm going to jump into the demo. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop right here. Brooke, how much time do I have left?
You know, you can keep going. I think about 5 to 7 minutes more. Okay.
Yeah. Let's be quick then. So, so for Angular 3, I have an ng-add schematics. So you can do ng-add Angular 3 / schematics, and this will set up. We'll install Angular 3, and we'll set up a couple of things so you can work with Angular 3 right away. So I have that, and if I look into my package.json file, I guess sharing screen is okay. So I have Angular 3 core right here, and the version 6. Oh, so I just released version 6 yesterday to support Angular 14. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my app component, and we're going to replace this kind of code with the Angular 3 code. So I'm going to just remove everything inside of here, and just remove that, save that. Okay. So on the template, I'm going to start with the NGT canvas and import that. And then I have the NGT mesh, right? And then I have NGT box geometry. And then I have NGT mesh basic material. And then on the material, I want the color to be a tomato. I want to save that. Now I'm going to go back to, it's not running, got to serve. Beginning. I'm going to go here, refresh. You don't see anything. Remember what I said. I want my canvas, my Three.js canvas, to take up the space of the parent. So what I can do is I can wrap this one inside of 400 pixel with 400 pixel. I can wrap my canvas inside like a container and say that. And I can have that. And now I can put this container anywhere that I want to. So, but for this demo purposes, I'm gonna use the root style and set my body to 100%. and the margin to be 0. So now my canvas is going to take up the whole scene. But what's missing? The animation, right? The animation is missing. So what we can do is go back to the component. Now on the mesh, there's a output called before render. So before I render, I want to do something, right? I want to grab the object of this, and it is a mesh, and I want to rotate the X, and I want to rotate the Y. Save that, and here I have an animated cube, a spinning cube, and I can resize, and the canvas will react to my resize, and that's it. That's all the code for the entity canvas, entity mask, box geometry, mask basic material, and the animation for the mesh. Now, why is this important to be in this kind of scenario where you have the power on the template? So what you can do now, you can make a cube component, right? Say selector, have cube, standalone, Chau, template. And I want to paste that in there. Import, and I move my on before render up to this cube, right? And replace this with the app cube. Do I have standalone? Yeah. Cube component, save. And now everything still works. So now I put my template of, the cube as the component that can have what? That can have input. Right? I can use input with this. I say, hey, I want you to be a precision. I can pass in precision for this one. And then say precision, be precision. Now with that, I can now have two cubes that I will move this one 1.5 to the right, and I will move this one 1.5 to the left, and I have two cubes. You can create more cubes if you want. It's just a matter of some input and a component. What else? I can have internal state. What if I want to have some like interactivity with the cube and say, hey, when I hover, I want a different color. And we can do that with some event. Hover equals true. We point it out. Hover equals false. So when I hover, I want my color to be turquoise. Turquoise. And when I upload, I want to be tomato. And save. Now go back here, and now I have interactivity. One last thing, because we run out of time. The one last thing is, if you like me, and then when you see some like 3D on the web, you will probably try to take the mouse and try to move around. You cannot do that out of the box, but with Angular 3, we can just install Angular 3 SOBA, 3 SDLib. SOBA is like a utilities, package to implement or complement the Angular 3 core package. And now with SOBA in place, I can use the entity SOBA, orbit control, and I just drop that in as component. Now, like, let's see, I think it's rebuilding. Yeah. It's rebuilding because we add another package. There we go. Now I can grab the 3D scene and move it around. So this is the power of the orbit controls. All right. I have more to share, but again, we run out of time. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to answer some questions.
Wow, first of all, that was so amazing to see that in Angular like that. So I will let these questions do a lot of my wowing for us though. So Guillermo, sorry if I say it wrong. Guillermo is wondering, he says, I'm learning about Three.js with Bruno Simon's course. Can I use Angular 3 for the hands-on exercises?
Yes, I'm learning that course as well, and I'm using Angular 3, and I was planning to stream on it, but then time has been a luxury. So yeah.
Okay, well, cool. And then Shearer would like to know, is there a simulator as well?
No, not that I know of.
Okay. Ty asks, does this work well with D3 graphs?
So I'm not sure. I know that D3, a lot of people are getting confused with D3 and Three.js. So D3 is a data visualization library. I mean, if this is DOM or SVG, then it can work with it. But I'm sure there's some like visualization using Three.js, so that can work as well.
Okay. You have some people just saying hello. Others who are wondering about your IDE settings and why the overall, like they'd like to know more about your overall development workflow.
So I happen to have a webinar with WebStorm not too long ago. I can share the link to that. In that webinar, I share my WebStorm setup and also all my key map setup and how I work with Angular specifically.
That'd be great. Yeah, I think any links you have would be really helpful. Are all of the events for Mesh part of Angular 3 docs, or would I need to read through Three.js?
So the event system of Angular 3 is a clone from the React 3 fiber event system. If you look through the documentation of Angular 3, there's a piece about event, and I link to the React 3 fiber event system. So the event system in Three.js is a little bit different. So you see, I try to make it familiar and developer friendly to the Angular developers by using the output syntax, right? But in fact, behind the scene is actually a raycaster event object going through the 3D scene, and like imagine like a light touching your object. So because everything is inside of canvas, so they don't have DOM event, but the event system of Angular 3, like custom event system, makes that possible, so that like Angular developers have a good time.
Nice. Yeah. It looked familiar. It wasn't overwhelming. All right, last one is they're saying they have encountered a use case where certain parts of a model need to be applied with different material or apply some color. Okay. Any pointers to satisfy such use cases, or have you encountered such use cases?
Yes. Can I share my screen again? Because I have that example. So if you go to, I'm sorry, I did not share this, but like it's angular3.netlify.app. If you go to documentation, you see the documentation, and there's an example, external link, and there's also Soba API external link. So the Soba is Storybook collection, and then the example is just an Angular application with examples. So what his name? I'm sorry. What the question point out was, hey, I have some GLTF model. I want to maybe reuse it with different color for the material, and this is exactly what it is. So we're using GLTF. So I have two shoes here, and this is the same GLTF model, but one is using the tomato color and one is the yellow color. So you can actually do that. And the code for this is pretty simple. Just go to that example. There's a source. That's the component. And this is the shoe right here. You have the model at the shoe, and by the way, you reload the model using a loader, and that's returned an observable. So you can use async type, and you can just list out whatever you want with the template. So geometry, the material. So here you can attach the material, different color, all of this. Yeah, you can do that.
Nice. Okay. Well, thank you. And seriously, everybody, I know that Chau's being sincere when he says reach out to him on Twitter. I know that he would love to answer questions there, work with you, whatever he's available to do. But thank you to all three of our speakers. Those were such fun presentations and like just lots of great learning. I know everybody in the chat has really been expressing a lot of gratitude as well, and we appreciate your time and putting in all of that effort to present with us tonight. So thank you, all three of you. I know Varun had to leave, but still, we're very grateful for his time.